Good morning. This morning we're going to be talking about forms of government and why it matters. And I have three goals for today's session. And the first of those goals is that at the end of the session, students will have learned descriptions of traditional forms of government. The second goal is that students will be able to compare the United States government to other forms of government throughout the world. And the third goal is that students will appreciate that governments change because of internal and external forces. Now, we might ask, where do governments come from? And there has been philosophical and theoretical discussions of that for a long time. And there are many theories. They're called theories, but actually they have a very practical application. And I want to go through four of the well-known theories of government origin. And the first of these is the divine theory, which holds that government is established by God, that there's a connection between God and the government, and it is ordained by God that the person in charge of the government is watching over the people in place of God. The second origin theory is natural theory, which holds that people are born with inalienable rights and governments are set up to protect those rights. The third theory is social compact. And social compact is a word that means agreement. And this theory holds that government is an agreement, that people got together and they decided to be self-governing. And they decided to govern themselves according to some standards that they wrote down. And then they all agreed to abide by those standards. The fourth theory is force theory, and we see this throughout history, where one person or a small group of people claim control over another population by force. Now, I want to begin our discussion of different types of government by talking about non-government. The term is anarchy, and it means the absence of government. And you can imagine that people ask themselves, why do we even need government? We're nice people. We can mind our own business. We can stay in our homes and work in our businesses or in our fields or wherever we make money. And we can be respectful to our neighbors. And we don't really need government interference. And the anarchy theory does hold that all people are free and equal, and that each person shall extend mutual aid and support to their neighbors as well as they can. And there are some historic examples of anarchy as a political faction, but I don't know of any actual government that ever was set up according to the principles of anarchy. We'll go on to describe some types of government that are well known throughout the world today and in the past. And the first of these is monarchy. We're pretty familiar with monarchy. There's a king and a queen who's in charge. And the marks of monarchy is hereditary rule, meaning that the king or the queen rules through a line. It's a family line. And as soon as the king or the queen dies, that ruler is then that king or queen's family member, typically a son or daughter, that then takes over, and so on. The rule is lifelong. The king or queen rules forever, and then the title of ruler descends. And frequently, the monarch embodies the identity of the nation. In the people's eyes, the monarch is the nation. They're very, very closely aligned in the eyes of the people. Another form of government that we see, that we talk about, is the plutocracy. And the traditional characteristics of a plutocracy is that power and authority are held by a small group of wealthy people. And the government decisions elevate the needs of this wealthy elite over the will of the majority of citizens. Now, you can imagine that this is not a very pleasant way to to be governed, if you're one among those governed and you're not part of this wealthy elite, it isn't something that you actually would endorse. So governments typically do not identify themselves as plutocracy, but we do look for marks of that type of government within existing government. Another form of government that we describe is the theocracy, and this goes back to that origin of government where divine rulers were ordained to be rulers by God. In this case, theocracy, a religious leader rules the country, and that leadership is believed to have a direct connection to God. And we see this today in the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have the Ayatollah who's in charge of the government, and the Ayatollah is the religious leader with a direct connection to God. Another form of government that we're familiar with throughout time is the dictatorship. And the traditional characteristics of a dictatorship is that there is a single leader and there's a lack of tolerance for any competing political pluralism. And there's also a suppression of civil liberty. So going back to that notion of individual rights held by individual people among the governed, that with a dictatorship is suppressed. That is not honored in a dictatorship, a totalitarian form of government. Now we have the republic, and the United States is a republic. And the traditional characteristics of a republic is that the power of government is restricted so that it does not trespass on those natural rights of the people. So we go back to the origin of government being a compact, a social compact. And power is then, as it's restricted, it's also distributed among departments. And each of these departments has an opportunity to check the work of the other part of government so that none of those parts of government becomes dominant or outweighs the value of the other parts of the same government. A republic is a government of laws, not of people. So as is different from the monarchy, when the leader is finished with the leader's term of office, that leader goes away. But the laws remain and bind the next leader in the government in a republic. Now, one of the things that we want to really make sure is understood is that governments change because of internal or external forces. And there is a multitude of reasons why governments would change and have changed over time. But I want to just begin this conversation by talking of some typical ones. And the first is revolution. And this country has a very good experience with revolution. That's how our government changed. It was an internal force that when the government years ago was actually the distant government in England, oversaw the colonies over here in North America. Those colonists became unhappy with the rule of England, rose up, revolted. There was a war, and the colonists won, and they became self-governing. So in this case, the people that were once ruled by England then became self-governing. So their government changed through internal forces. Colonialism is kind of the opposite of that. That is where people who are distant from a strong, powerful nation somewhere else in the world, and that strong, powerful nation goes beyond its own borders and sort of takes over the people, the region, the geography, the real estate, far from where they are. And they set up what's called a colony. And then that colony is drawn into the empire. And this would be an example where the British Empire incorporated the people who live now in the country we call India. There are many, many examples of this, of the British Empire a couple hundred years ago, I guess the 1700s, 1800s, where colonialism, that was an external force that changed the government of the people who were affected by it. Another way governments change is as spoils of war. And we know that throughout history, there have been wars. And there's a winner and there's a loser. And the people who live in the boundaries, within the boundaries of the losing side, sometimes find that the borders of their country have changed and they now belong to another country because as a result of the war, the boundaries changed, and that'd be an external force to change the government of the people who were affected. And finally, we'll talk about peaceful change. And peaceful change is generally called, is generally internal change that happens over time. And that is also very typical as we look at history with a long enough lens. And let's look at China and Russia. Both of these are countries that are in the news all the time, and we know they are very, very old. Their history goes way, way back, and these histories are very complicated. But we know that in the early 20th century, both of those countries experienced violent overthrow of their rulers and were replaced then by an authoritarian rule. And if we study that history, we know that up to now, modern times, current times, that authoritarian rule has taken on some democratic forms. We hear about elections being held in Russia. We hear about private ownership of property in China. There are political parties and factions that are tolerated in both of those countries. That is an internal change that has happened within a government that was once considered to be completely authoritarian. Another example of change in government is the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was in Germany between the First and the Second World War. And we know that at that time, Germany had lost the First World War and the people were suffering, and they were really being oppressed by economic forces that had to do with the war that they waged in World War I. There rose a very charismatic leader that gave them a sense of power that they had not had for many years, and gave them a feeling that they could overcome what was oppressing them at the time. And through peaceful change, President Hindenburg, again, we're talking about a republic, appointed Adolf Hitler, who was that person I'm talking about, that rising leader, that rising star in Germany. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany. And then not long afterward was elected by the people president of Germany. And this was a completely democratic process. There was nothing oppressive about this. There was no internal strife or war. This was done within the bounds of the laws. But quickly after Adolf Hitler became president of Germany, things changed, and it very quickly moved to be a totalitarian government that was operated by a dictator who we know to be Adolf Hitler. So that changed quite quickly, and it was a real good example of internal change. Let's talk about the evolution of the monarchy in the United Kingdom, because we're pretty familiar with the UK, and we know again that at one time the monarch ruled by divine right, and the God again had made the king king, and that went through the family line because of that belief. There came a time, the year 1215, when one of the levels of aristocracy in England delivered the Magna Carta, called the Great Charter, to the monarch and said, we'd like a little power. We'd like you to share some of your power. And that was actually the first time or one of the first times perhaps, in history where, in this case, it was nobility, but it was an attempt, and a successful one, to wrestle control for the people from the all-powerful monarch. This developed within the history of the United Kingdom a constitutional monarchy, where today the power of the monarch is limited by a constitution. And this is pretty common in the monarchies that still survive, particularly in Europe.
If I can just jump in,
Sure.
In all the cases of change that you're talking about,
Yes.
The changes don't happen for random reasons, especially like with the English monarchy. The reason that they came to the king was because he wasn't doing a good job of meeting the needs of the people. So a lot of times these internal changes, you mentioned in Germany, the needs of the people weren't being met. It's because the government isn't fulfilling that social contract or social compact that you were talking about that really drives people to change. If things are going well, generally a government doesn't change. But when things start going bad or poorly, that's when people start saying, maybe we should try something different.
That's a really, really good point. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a very good point. We're going to kind of touch on that maybe a little bit later. So just going over again, the constitutional monarchy is where the king now, according to what Chris was saying, because of the dissatisfaction people had found with the way the absolute rule of the monarch today, that used to be absolute monarch, now is the non-party political head of government without any power to set policy or choose political leaders. And the Constitution, not the monarch, but the Constitution provides the framework of government, and the Constitution limits the monarch's power. So that's a big, big change. Now, again, we're talking about the formation of the United States government. We've referred to it as a republic, and I think we can. Again, in this form of government, the supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives. And the head of government is elected for a limited amount of time. So like we said, when that person in power has their term is finished, they go away. And in a republic, the decisions are made by elected representatives who also go away if, as we talked earlier, people are unhappy with their decisions, then they aren't reelected. Our Constitution, and I want to quote from it, is in its preamble says that this Constitution is here to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves. That means to the people and our posterity, and that means for generations to come. So again, it's speaking to the needs of the people and the needs of the people in the future. So I'd like to just talk briefly about the differences that we see between some of the forms that I discussed and the current United States government that we experience here in our lifetime. Could we just have a little discussion on the difference between, even though the U.S. doesn't have a king or a queen, are there any big differences that we see between the U.S. and the U.K.?
Well, we don't have any figureheads that last for nearly as long as a king or queen. So the current Queen of England, Elizabeth II, has been queen since shortly after World War II in the 1950s. And she is still queen to this day. Whereas the United States has had 9 or 10 presidents in that time.
Yes, that's true. And but the political power in the UK, it rests, as we said, in their governmental structures, and they've had a turnover in their leadership throughout her reign. They've had a bunch of different changes in their political leadership.
Right? Very true. Yes.
Yeah. So that's similar. So the two governments are really, there's a lot of differences, but they're sort of the same in the way leadership comes and goes in both countries. I want to ask a question about a plutocracy, because we talked about the plutocracy and we talked about how it was not a particularly pleasant way to be governed. At least that's what I think. We have a lot of discussion in this country today about income inequality. That meaning that few people have a lot of money and resources, and a lot of people have a lot less money and resources. So is that a mark of a plutocracy?
Well, as you said, nobody's going to describe themselves as being a plutocracy. It's one of those terms that is used by other people to describe a government that they don't like. In the same way that you hear a term like hipster used to describe people who might be inauthentic in their interests. Nobody describes themselves as a hipster, but other people might call you one. So democracies, again, they show those traits exactly that you were talking about, where wealth gets consolidated and where power gets combined on a smaller and smaller group of people. And so because of that, there are certainly aspects in almost every modern government that could be deemed plutocratic, that lean towards that when one group starts to get more power or influence. The question is how well can a government rebalance itself from those things? So we see Russia, for example, has really struggled. There's been a very strong pro-republic, pro-democracy movement in Russia, but a lot of people that have power have really resisted those reforms. And so a lot of us in America would probably describe what we see in Russia as a plutocracy, because it is a relatively few people with a lot of money and influence that call the shots. But they hold elections. They do have political parties. So they would not describe themselves that way. And probably the United States, by people unhappy with the United States, would say that there are aspects of our own government that allow certain groups to have more influence, as you talked about income inequality. And so, again, I think it's one of those things where when you recognize that those are things to be aware of, and you recognize these are the traits that make a country less equal, that it really, plutocracy ought to serve as a warning to every country about the trends that they want to work to avoid. Because no country, no matter what other system they have, is immune from those traits.
I see. Okay, thank you for that. Moving on to a question about theocracy. I think it's our money. One of our money says, I think in God we trust on it, or one of our bills does. And we, in our Pledge of Allegiance, we say our one nation under God. Is that a mark of a theocracy in this country?
That's a great question. Theocracy is really defined by how religion is wielded in laws. So there are a lot of countries that have religious underpinnings to ceremonies or to symbolism. If you go to England, for example, we were talking about England quite a bit this morning. England technically has an official church. And if you go back far enough, belonging to the wrong church could get you in really hot water. These days, there is no, even though there's an official church, you don't have to belong to it. There's no penalty for belonging to a different religion. So we would not describe England as a theocracy, even though they have an official religion. Contrast that with Iran, like you were talking about. In Iran, if you say the wrong thing, you can be put on trial for things like blasphemy or impugning the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, who is both a religious and a political leader. And so it's really how does the religion influence the laws? And so the United States, we have some symbolic ties to religion, but even those are actually very weak for most governments. In God we trust is on the money, as you mentioned, but that doesn't really carry the weight of law on anything. It's just symbolic.
I see. Oh, good point. And then finally, dictatorship, and I'll just use an example today that we are experiencing. Is it the mark of a dictatorship to tell people the government, for the government to tell people to stay home?
Yeah, that's a great one. It probably depends on what the purpose of the government doing that for is. If the government is doing that to squash dissent, to keep people from sharing their opinions, then it definitely is a sign of dictatorship. What we're seeing during the current health crisis is the government is asking people to stay home largely for their own safety and their own protection, and it's considered to be a temporary measure. Now, there are a lot of governments that started off as a republic and free and slid into a dictatorship using what they claimed were temporary measures. So right now, the United States is not a dictatorship, but 10 years from now or 3 years from now, we might have a different view of it, depending on how the government uses the temporary powers that it's used. Going back to the original republic, which is the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic is what that started off as. And it became a totalitarian government under Julius Caesar because Julius Caesar needed to defend the country under war. And the senators of Rome voted to give Caesar special powers. And then he never gave up those powers. And so that's really where it lies, is any sort of dictatorship relies on one person sort of controlling and not being willing to give up the power they have. And the United States has been lucky that we haven't had to worry about that. We haven't had that problem. But it is something that when our founders started the country, they were always worried about and encouraged people to be vigilant for. And so many times when people have tried to claim new powers, even things that we look at very positively now, like President Abraham Lincoln, he was accused by some people of being a dictator because he suspended a lot of liberties during the Civil War to try and keep the country safe. Now, Lincoln lifted some of those restrictions near the end of his term, and of course, he died before he could lift all of them. But his predecessors lifted the rest. Or his successors, I should say. The people that followed him lifted the rest. So again, dictatorship is one of those things that nobody wants to really be it unless you're the dictator. And then again, usually by the time you realize you're living in a dictatorship, it's too late to do anything but try to change the government by force.
Okay, thanks. I think all those comments really reinforced why it matters. Why it matters that we learn about forms of government and we're able to see how governments change, because we know that change is inevitable. And as Chris said in many of the responses he gave to the previous questions, change begins long before it's noticed by most people. We can notice that there's a temporary change in our rules, but it is called temporary, and it isn't till we get past that sometime that we realize that what was temporary has now become permanent. So it's important that people not take their current system of government for granted. And of course, as we also pointed out earlier in the discussion with Chris, was that it's always wise to advocate for change, because if the government isn't meeting people's needs, then people need to speak up before things happen, and then it's too late. So we look forward to being participants in change in the Republic. I'm just going to finish today's session with a few frequently asked questions that I think come up. And the first of these is a democracy a form of government? Because I at least hear, and I get confused between, are we a democracy or a republic? A democracy could be a form of government, except it's unrealistic, because in a pure democracy, people would vote on every single law. There wouldn't be any elected representatives that would stand in the place of the people and go to Congress and conduct the business of the people. The people would have to do it, and it would be unrealistic and unwieldy. Another question is communism a form of government? And I think at least we hear a lot of that as being interchangeable. Communism is a form of government. Well, it's not. It's an economic system. Capitalism is an economic system. The reason why I think we hear a lot of that interchangeability is because economic systems often closely are associated with government, because government systems tend to rule and make decisions that support their economic system. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's consistent. But we see those two as being very closely aligned because of the way government behaves.
Well, and just to build off that, I would say that a couple of historical examples, the Soviet Union utilized communism because communism really pushed for people to give up a lot of their individual power for the good of the whole, for the good of the collective. And so the idea was that rather than having like a plutocracy, which is what Russia had before, or well, actually a monarchy before, they wanted a government where everybody sort of got equal treatment, and there was sort of no individualism, because individualism had led them to having a king that they weren't happy with. In the United States, we really promote individualism, and so we promote individual rights, and capitalism is an economic extension of that. So like you were saying, these are very closely connected, because capitalism allows you to make choice with what to do with your money, in the same way that a democratic republic allows a lot of freedoms for people to make choices on what they do with their life, on what they do with their politics, and what they do with their beliefs. So I just wanted to bring those up as examples, because like what you're saying is very true. The economics and the politics are often very closely linked.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. The third question is there any form of world government? And, the short answer to that is no, but we have to recognize that there are treaties and alliances that create formal ties among countries. And then we also have to recognize that there is the European Union. It is a union of about 27 members, and it promises borderless trade within the European Union, and they use a common currency. So it's not world government, but it's a large government that exists beyond the boundaries of specific countries. And the final question is the United Nations a form of world government? And I think that could be kind of confusing sometimes. The role of the United Nations is that it is a voluntary organization. Members are voluntarily part of the UN, and they vote on resolutions that are binding only if the member agrees to be bound. So much of the work we hear coming out of the United Nations is advisory and not binding on the entire world. But it's an important component of the alliances that countries enjoy among themselves, and a form of dispute resolution too, I might add. So I think that's all. That's the end of this presentation. Chris, did you have anything else?
No, I think that was great. I'll just add on to the United Nations that, like you said, it's voluntary, and it's really more a way to make sure that countries always have a way to talk to each other, because a lot of previous the United Nations was created after World War II. 2 world wars had happened, and people felt that a big reason that they'd happened is because the heads of the governments weren't talking to each other enough, and that a lot of the differences could have been worked out if they had more open communication. So it's as you said, it's voluntary. It's like a big club, and everybody at the club can talk to everybody else. But at the end of the day, some people are going to choose not to follow the rules, and there's limits to how much the United Nations can do that without everybody agreeing to it. So other than that, I think everything was great.
Okay,